In our keynote addresses this year, we are fortunate to have 3 distinguished guests of honor. Our first keynote speaker is Marianne BERTRAND, Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Her research spans labor economics, corporate finance, political economy, and development economics. She's also the director of the Inclusive Economy Lab at the University of Chicago Urban Labs. So please join me in welcoming Professor BERTRAND.
Thank you. Great. First, thank you so much to the organizer for including me in what looks like going to be 2 fantastic days. The topic is very, very vast, so when thinking about what I was going to speak about, there could have been a lot to say. I've spent 25 years of my life at the University of Chicago, so I do not believe that I can say we should trash capitalism. I think they will revoke my tenure if I were to do that, so this is not where I'm going to go. But on the other hand, I thought it would be good in a sense to reflect on how, at least from my understanding, the US, which is really, has become my home, ended up where it is today. And I think it is fair to say that it's a country that has a crisis of capitalism and also a crisis of democracy. So what I will do is kind of take you through my understanding of how we got there and finish with some thoughts about reforms. Great. And I'll put the University of Chicago centrally back on the stage. I believe that the US economy has transformed dramatically over the last 50 years. Obviously, the US has been a capitalist society from the very beginning, but the nature of capitalism has changed since, I would say, the late 1970s and the early 1980s. The focus on shareholder wealth maximization, the idea that free markets are what we should be focusing on, no coercion, voluntary exchange, and also a growing distrust in the role that the government should be playing in the economy, in markets in general. And obviously, Milton Friedman's, is a central name associated with these ideas. It's a broader theme, obviously, of the Chicago School of Economics. But I'm going to highlight here kind of this sentence that is in this piece that Friedman wrote in 1970 for the New York Times, saying that the only social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. And it was obviously economic ideas, but economic ideas that really had an impact on governments. Whether you think about Reagan in the US, whether you think about Margaret Thatcher and the changes that happened in UK around that same time period, I think it's fair to say that economic ideas, economic thought really translated into changes in the way business operates. And the form it took was really about the government stepping back from many sectors of the economy where the government interfered, right? So this is finance, this is a sector of the economy. If you look at the green light, it goes up when there's more regulation of the financial industry. You can see that there's been a U-shape in the regulation of the financial industry. We experienced the Great Depression in the 1920s. Too much risk-taking by banks. The Glass-Steagall Act was meant to kind of constrain the amount of risk-taking and the more hazard problems with the banks. That led to more regulation in the 1980s. We went back in the other direction, and I don't have to tell you the story of the other issues that the financial sector experienced. At the same time as the financial sector gets deregulated, the earnings of bankers or earnings of people working in finance increases. If you think about the change in CEO compensation, which is one component, really just one component of income inequality, you can also see, I think, the impact of this change in how business are being operated. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, The CEOs of companies were kind of like compensated like bureaucrats. You run a bigger company, your earnings go up. What changed with Friedman with his focus on shareholder wealth is that we started paying CEOs as a function of the stock prices of their companies. We started paying a lot of stock options that really, led to a large increase in the compensation of CEOs. So it's really a change in how we incentivize the people that run firm to get them to focus on profit maximization. All right, so just reflecting on where Friedman was coming from, if you think about the doctrine, I think there are multiple parts in it. One is a part that has to do with principal-agent problem. The people that run firms, the managers, the CEOs, they are not the owners of the firm if you think about a public corporation. Individuals that have capital have basically asked them to manage their money on their behalf. And Friedman says, well, as the CEO of the company, you're just the agent to this principle, and your duty is to return to this principle as much earnings as possible. That's kind of part of his reasoning why businesses should be focused on maximizing profits. But I think the other part of the reasoning, which is, I think, well encapsulated in some of the other quotes here coming from the same op-ed in the New York Times, is that there's a sense that this focus on profit maximization is ultimately what is best for society, right? The role of the corporation is to make a profit and maximize social welfare through the efficiency it entails. And that's nothing different from Adam Smith's old ideas about the invisible hand. And markets are really quite special and quite magical, right? You have individuals that are self-interested in their own utility. You have firms that are just self-interested, trying to maximize profits. And all of these exchanges will end up with this maximization of social welfare. Okay, so I think that's an important part of the logic behind Friedman. What I want to make clear here is that there's always a tendency, thinking about philosophy, to equate the maximization of social surplus with what is consequentially, in terms of maximizing happiness, the best outcome. It's not quite the same thing, right? If you think about a demand curve, right, it maps people's willingness to pay for a cancer drug, for example. My willingness to pay is a function of how much I want this drug, but also how much money I have. I may want a cancer drug very, very much, but if I have no money, I'm going to have very little willingness to pay for the product, right? So distribution of endowments are important. Different distribution of endowment are going to lead to different allocation of welfare between individuals. Now, putting that aside, I think the thing that I want to stress is that this view that what is best for society is for firms to maximize profit is only true in the absence of market imperfection. When you have market imperfection, this is no longer the case. And what I think has happened in the US is that the emphasis that we have had for the last 50 years or so on government failures. Government can't get it right. Government cannot fix the market failures has led us to ignore these market failures, and the government has retreated from trying to fix them. So externalities is the most classical one, right? The US has done essentially nothing in terms of addressing climate change. If you go and look at the history of what had happened, I think about 20 years ago, US Congress was so close to passing a federal cap-and-trade system. And there was a lot of excitement because it looked like we were creating a new market. And at some point, this got presented as a new tax, and there was immediate pushback. No, we don't want to do this, right? So we don't want to tax, government should not interfere. Information imperfection is obviously another form of market failure. If you think about the debate in the US right now, again, there's other places where we're failing, which is providing health insurance to people. The pushback has been what? Against an individual mandate that is coercing, quote unquote, people to acquire health insurance if they're healthy, but we're not going to get a well-functioning market for healthcare if we do not have an individual mandate that address the adverse selection that is so central to those markets. Another thing that has been changing a lot has been the rise in market power in the US, the rise in concentration, big businesses, mergers and acquisition. there's no doubt there's been a retreat from the antitrust enforcement that has led to the creation of very large firms that are not taking prices as given, but in fact are really having power over the consumers, and furthermore, a rise in monopsonies, right? For a lot of workers in the US right now, firms have become so big in their geography that when they're looking for work, there's only one employer they're going to be able to find. As you can imagine, that kind of imbalances does not give the workers a lot of outside options. There's only one employer that's going to damp down the wages. The other part where you've seen, a retreat, and again, thinking about the connections between what I'm talking about here and, say, for example, Project 2025, which I'm assuming you've heard about, is, I think we've done a lot in economics in understanding that people are not ultra-rational. They do not always know what they want. They have biases, they make mistakes, they're lazy, they don't pay attention to little footnotes when they buy a product. And again here, right, we know that it's towards market equilibrium, but the US has been, again, in the context of pushing back on government, reversing some of the attempt to correct these market issues. Okay, so I think what is further reinforcing this, this dynamic that I described starting in the late 70s, early 80s, has been what I would say a vicious cycle that the US has been caught in, right? You have a weakening of government oversight over business that has increased the economic power of businesses. It has increased the wealth of the ultra-rich. We don't want to tax. We reduce the marginal tax rate. What does that do? All that only increases the political power of businesses and the ultra-rich, and that further weakens our government, and I would say, in this moment, I think extremely salient, I think weakens our democracy. In the US context, a lot of this vicious cycle is very much grounded in the amazingly beautiful First Amendment of the US Constitution that says that we can all go and petition our government and we can go and protest and demonstrate. The problem is that we have extended this First Amendment to the ability to spend as much money as you want in US elections, and that has really made it easier and easier for corporations with the resources, individuals with the resources, to pay to get people elected that will then help them continue and extend the vested interest. All right, so I think this dynamic, can very much be tied back to facts that I think you are well aware of, I think have already been mentioned in the opening remarks. If you look at this figure, and there's a lot of discussion about, is it exactly right? People push back on exactly the magnitude of the divergence between these two lines, but if you go up until the late 70s, early 1980s, US productivity was going up, and wages, average wages, were going up, pretty much at the same rate as productivity. What you've seen since the 1980s is basically a divergence between these two lines. Productivity has kept on going at about the same rate, but wages have not kept up. Okay, so there's been a big decline in labor share and an increase in the profit share in the economy. The other figures that I'm sure you're well aware of, which I think have a lot to do with the dynamics that I described, are the rise in wealth concentration. This is the top 1% share. So the top 1% of households in the US by today control 40% of the wealth. In the US, the top 0.1% control about 20% of the wealth. Okay. Beyond the focus on what's happening at the top of the income distribution, which I think people pay a lot of attention to, what worries me even more is that the US has become a place that is less socially mobile than it used to be, right? You have a situation where young people, the chances of moving up in income distribution is becoming lower and lower. Why? Because we don't have enough tax revenues to invest in the kind of schools that would create the opportunities for the young people that were not born with a silver spoon in their mouths. Young people today, thinking about the crisis and what is driving some of the populism, have a lower chance, have about a 50% chance to be better off than their parents, compared to a 90% chance if you look at people that were born in my mom's generation. All right, so I'm looking at the clock. Maybe I'll skip this, and I'll talk briefly about reforms, okay? And before I do that, I also want to make sure, and I'm not sure whether this expression translates well in Japanese, that we do not throw the baby with the bathwater. By which I mean, this capitalist system has created the crisis that I just described, but it is also been transformational for so many people around the world, right? That's a conversation that we should have more when we think about trade. Trade has created a lot of losers in the US. But trade has elevated out of poverty so many people in the developing world, right? So as we think about reforming the system, we also have to keep that in mind. Good. All right, so I'll tell you what I think about reforms. From my perspective, at the macro level, at the systemic level, the way we fix US capitalism, and in fact, at this point, really US democracy, is by finding ways, and I don't know how we do that, but to rebuild some kind of trust in the ability for the government to do good in the system, okay? I have one study I'll briefly mention where you tell people about how much income inequality there is in the US. They learn that information. They learn it's way more inequality than they thought it was. And then you ask them, well, would you be in favor of higher taxes? And people say no. And then you ask them, well, why? You know, you would benefit. Well, I don't trust the government to do anything good with this tax money. So I think fixing the system means rebuilding trust in the government. I think we need to find ways to control regulatory capture. We need to find ways to reduce the influence of money in elections, in lawmaking, and in rulemaking. We need to make the public sector a place where talented people want to go and work in. Right? In the US, the difference in compensation between working in the private and public sector is so large that it's hard to attract talented people in the public sector. We need more civic education, more civic engagement, and obviously, you know, we need to find a way to deal with the media situation where a lot of the information that is needed to really understand where things are is just not shared by people because people live in different echo chambers where they're dealing with misinformation and disinformation. At the smaller level, I would say that the kind of things that we are seeing is a rise in sustainable investing, right? So I'll just want to acknowledge that this is happening, where we still have this shareholder primacy, but now we are allowing for shareholders to care about other things than just maximizing profits. And I would say that this rise in sustainable investing has taken two main forms. I like to contrast them as voice versus exit. The first one is exit. So what is that? Is me investing my money, but saying I don't want to invest my money in companies that are doing bad things. Right? And a lot of the ESG funds out there are essentially that. They screen out companies that are hurting the environment, companies that have bad human rights record in the developing countries where they operate. I have little hope in that as a way to fix our system. Why? First, because, and that's related to the remarks that we just heard, it relies on these ESG ratings, which are extremely gameable. If you ever look at ESG ratings coming from two different providers, there's essentially zero correlation between them. It's also, I think, not a great strategy because if you think about screening out bad companies, you essentially end up with investing all your money in the tech sector, which tells you that the measurement issues are really first order. And then it's problematic in that to the extent that these bad companies keep on operating, now the people that own the shares in these companies are going to be the people that don't care. It's kind of like having the inmates in charge of the asylum, okay? The other approach, which I'm much more excited about, again, I don't think that's going to lead to systemic change, but is the voice strategy. where we, as owners of the shares in company, can go and tell the management of the company, we want you to do something different, right? And the rise of shareholder proposals and proxies has been a big part of that. This is an area where shareholders are stepping in and say, you know what? We don't want you to go and spend money in lobbying. We want you to be transparent about your climate impacts. This is an area that I think needs more fine-tuning, though, because I certainly don't directly vote my shares. Institutional investors do that on my behalf. And those institutional investors are torn in the current system because they have fiduciary duties that are about maximizing profit. So we need to fix that. More generally, I think there's a lot of good thinking that should go into trying to create more successful shareholder democracies. The final thing I'll mention is change in organizational form. Again, still very much micro-level, small steps. What we're seeing in the US is the rise of an alternative to the standard corporation, in particular the rise of public benefit corporations. So public corporations, still for profit, but have in their priorities not only shareholder wealth, but really a situation where the board is legally required to consider the interest of all stakeholders, the employees, the customers, the community, the environment, along financial returns, okay? Patagonia is one of those companies. As you may have just learned, OpenAI is now one of those companies, moving from nonprofits to something with somewhat harder profit consideration, but still not a full corporation. I think this is still a very young form, so I think we don't know much about how it's going to work. But the concern is always going to be about multitasking. Like being a manager of a public benefit corporation is a much harder job than being a manager of a standard corporation. Right? And we still, I think, don't have a good sense of how, when a group comes and sues the companies for having violated its obligation to, say, the workers, this will play out in court. But it's certainly a model that is on the rise, and I'm interested in following. All right, so I'm going to conclude. I went too long, I'm sure. What I will say is that, from my perspective, this future growth of sustainable investing, the public benefit corporation movement, will critically depend on having enough shareholders out there that care about more than just maximizing profits. And I'm hopeful to believe that there are many of those shareholders, but I certainly don't believe that's all shareholders out there, which means that these forms will end up being fairly limited. And then finally, you know, when I think about these formats, yes, we're going to have the preferences of the shareholders, which may be going beyond maximizing the dividends that they receive, being better reflected in the decision that corporations make, but that's not a democracy, right? That's only a manifestation of the preferences of the people that have the money to invest in business. One share, one vote is not one person, one vote, and I think as a country, we'd better make sure that all voices are heard when we think about the values that we want for our society going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Bertrand.